Have you ever wondered what people did before smartphones? Before television? Well, before even books were common. They had lives, they had jobs, families, and fears. And they had fun. They gathered in smoky taverns, in drafty castle halls, and on dusty roadsides. And they played games. Not video games. Board games. Games made of wood, stone, bone, and leather. Games that weren't just about passing time. They were about thinking, scheming, and connecting with other people. And what did a Viking warrior do on a long sea voyage? He played a game of strategy on a carved wooden board. Like, how did a medieval monk exercise his mind? He played a game based on complex mathematical theory. These games tell us a story. A story about what our ancestors valued. They valued cunning over brute force. They saw beauty in numbers. They understood that life was a mix of luck and strategy. Most of these games are gone now, buried in the dirt or faded from memory. They were replaced by flashier, faster things. But what if we could dig them up? What if we could sit down and play a game that a Roman legionary or a Saxon king once played? What would we learn about them? And what would we learn about ourselves? Number 19, what if a game was only about setting traps? Imagine a game with no king to capture, no finish line to cross. The only goal is to trap your opponent, to squeeze them, to leave them with no moves left. That's the core idea behind a whole family of ancient games, and one of its earliest and simplest forms was likely a Roman game called Insidiae. The name itself means ambush or trap. It's a game that feels primal. It's about surrounding your enemy, cutting off their escape. We don't have a perfect preserved rulebook for Insidiae. Much of what we know is pieced together from fragments. The Roman poet Ovid mentions a game of this type in his work Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, written around 2 AD. He describes a game where one piece is captured when it's caught between two enemy pieces. This is the fundamental mechanic. It's called custodial capture. You don't land on a piece to take it. You trap it, you flank it. The board would have been a simple grid, perhaps lines scratched into a stone tablet or a wooden plank. Each player had an equal number of pieces, maybe 12. They would start on opposite sides of the board. Players take turns moving one piece, one space along a line. You can't jump. You just slide from one intersection to the next. The moment you move one of your pieces so that an opponent's piece is now sandwiched between two of yours, you capture it. You remove it from the board. The winner is the player who captures all of the opponent's pieces. It sounds simple, and it is, but the strategy can get deep. You have to think several moves ahead. You're not just trying to attack, you're also trying to build defensive walls. You need to keep your pieces in groups so they can't be easily picked off, but if you keep them too close together, you can't spread out to trap your opponent. It becomes a tense game of positioning, a slow, grinding battle where a single mistake can cause a whole section of your line to collapse. This wasn't a game for the impatient, it was a game of methodical pressure. The idea of Insidiae didn't die with Rome, it lived on. The concept of custodial capture is the heart of many of the Tafel games, like Nefatafel, which the Vikings played centuries later. It's a completely different way of thinking compared to modern games like chess or checkers, where you capture by replacement. In Insidiae, the empty space is just as important as the occupied space. You are fighting for control of the board itself. The game reflects a military reality. It's not about a single heroic charge. It's about logistics, encirclement, and breaking the enemy's formation. It's a game that a Roman centurion, obsessed with discipline and formation, would have understood perfectly. We find boards that could have been used for this game scratched into the steps of ancient forums and temples. These weren't fancy, store-bought sets. They were graffiti. They were the way a couple soldiers or merchants killed an hour. They would have used pebbles, seeds, or bits of broken pottery as pieces. This was a game for everyone. It required no special equipment, just a surface, a few lines, and a handful of tokens. It was a piece of culture that was as common and widespread as a deck of cards is today. We have the basic concept, but the details are lost. We assume players took turns moving one piece. But what if they had to move a piece? What if you could be forced into a trap you saw coming but couldn't avoid? Were there variants played on different size grids, leading to wildly different strategies? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how many prayers, curses, and boasts were whispered over these simple scratched lines now silent under our feet? Number 18, why would you bet on a game you can't control? Most of the games we remember from the medieval period are about strategy. They are about outthinking your opponent. But People then, like people now, also loved to gamble. They loved the thrill of pure dumb luck. And one of the most popular gambling games of the late Middle Ages was a game called Poch. It was a German game that spread across Europe in the 15th century. Its name, Pochen, means to knock or to boast, which gives you a pretty good idea of the atmosphere around the table. Poch wasn't played with a normal board. It was played on a special octagonal tray or board with different compartments. These compartments had labels like marriage, sequence, ace, king, king, queen. There was also a central pot, often called the Poch pot. The game used a standard deck of cards, which were themselves becoming more common in Europe at the time. It was a fusion of a board game and a card game. Here's how it worked. At the start of a round, every player had to put a chip or a coin into each of the compartments on the board. This was the ante. Then, the dealer would deal out the cards. The game had two main phases. The first phase was all about betting on specific card combinations in your hand, a bit like poker. Someone might declare they have a sequence of cards. If someone else had a better sequence, they could challenge and win the chips from the sequence compartment. The same went for marriage, a king and queen of the same suit, and other combinations. This part involved bluffing and betting. It was loud and exciting. The second phase was more like a simple trick-taking game. The player with the ace of trumps would lead. Other players had to follow suit if they could. The person who played the highest card in the sequence would win all the chips from the central poach pot. This was the big prize. So even if you had a terrible hand for the first phase, you could still win big if you were dealt one lucky card. What's fascinating about Poch is its pure focus on chance and money. There is some skill in the betting and bluffing, but a huge part of it comes down to the cards you are dealt. It wasn't a game for quiet contemplation like Rithmomachi or Shatranj. This was a game for taverns. For soldiers in their barracks, for merchants with coins to spare. It was fast-paced. Money changed hands quickly. It was the medieval equivalent of a casino game. The game's design shows a shift in society. The rise of a merchant class meant more people had disposable income. The spread of playing cards made games like this possible. The board itself was a technology. It was a tool for organizing the gambling. It made the rules clear and the pots easy to manage. Peter Bruegel the Elder, the famous 16th century painter, depicted scenes of peasant life, and while he didn't paint Poch specifically, his works are filled with the kind of rowdy, chaotic energy that would have surrounded a game like this. It was a game of the common people. Poch is an ancestor of many modern card games. You can see elements of it in poker, in Newmarket, and other gambling games. It shows that for every thoughtful strategist playing chess in a castle, there were a dozen people in a pub shouting, bluffing, and praying for the turn of a single card. The rules we have are reconstructions. Were there house rules that varied from tavern to tavern? We know the compartments on the board, but what other combinations did people bet on that weren't official? And the biggest question, how many fortunes were won and lost, how many friendships were broken, and how many fights were started over a simple wooden tray filled with coins? Number 17, can a game be an act of worship? We think of games as a diversion, a way to escape from the serious parts of life. But what if a game was designed to be the opposite? What if it was created to reinforce the most serious ideas of its time? That's the mystery of a game called Alea Evangelii, or the Game of the Gospels. This is one of the strangest and most fascinating games on this list. It's a massive game played on a 1919 grid, the same size as a modern Go board. But this was no Go. Our primary source for this game comes from a single manuscript, Corpus Christi College, Oxford, manuscript 122, dating from around the 11th or 12th century. The manuscript describes a game board and the layout of the pieces. It's a variant of the Tafal family of games like Nefertafal. It's an asymmetrical game. One side has a king and his defenders who start in the center. The other side has a much larger force of attackers who start on the edges. The goal of the king's side is for the king to escape to one of the corners of the board. The goal of the attackers is to capture the king. But here's where it gets weird. The manuscript gives a very specific and very symbolic layout for the pieces. The pieces are arranged in a cross shape. The text that accompanies the board diagram explains this layout in explicitly Christian theological terms. Each piece, or group of pieces, is linked to a specific saint, martyr, or biblical concept. It attempts to map the structure of the game onto the structure of the early Christian church and its struggles. The game is presented not just as a game, but as an allegory. The manuscript was written by an Anglo-Saxon monk. His name was probably an Irish one, suggesting a connection to the vibrant intellectual culture of Irish monasteries at the time. He saw the abstract strategy of a tafel game and decided to infuse it with meaning. The central king piece, trying to escape, becomes a symbol for Christ or the Christian soul. The surrounding attackers are the forces of evil, the pagans, the temptations of the world. Playing the game becomes a meditation on Christian doctrine. The sheer size of the board makes Alea Evangelii a monster of a game. A standard Nefertafel game on an 11 by 11 board is already complex. A 19 by 19 board with dozens of pieces would be an epic undertaking. A single game could last for hours. This was not a quick game to pass the time. It was a serious intellectual exercise. It was probably played by monks in a monastery, men who had the time and the education to appreciate its complexity and its symbolism. The historian H.J.R. Murray, in his foundational book, A History of Board Games Other Than Chess, was one of the first modern scholars to seriously study the manuscript and bring the game to light. Did anyone actually play it this way? Or was it just a theoretical exercise by a creative monk? You know, it's hard to say. The board itself is a standard grid. You could play a normal tafel game on it. The symbolic overlay might have been just one man's personal project, but it shows how deeply religion was woven into every aspect of medieval life. Nothing was just for fun, like everything could be a tool for understanding God's plan. Even a board game could be a sermon. Was Alea Evangelii ever a popular game, or was it a unique creation documented in a single manuscript? So did the monk who documented it invent the symbolism, or was he recording a tradition that was already established? And most compellingly, if you were a monk playing this game and you sacrificed a piece named after a specific saint to save your king, did you feel a twinge of guilt? Did the game ever feel too real? Number 16, what if pieces moved like an accordion? When we think of medieval games, we usually think of Europe, but fascinating things were happening all over the world. In Japan, during their medieval period, a game called Hasami Shogi was being played. It's a variant of shogi, or Japanese chess, but it's much simpler and has a very unique feel. The name Hasami means to sandwich or to scissor, and that tells you everything you need to know about how you capture pieces. Hasami Shogi is played on a 9x9 board, the same as a regular shogi board, but without any markings on the squares. Each player starts with 9 pieces, all of the same type. They're usually shaped like the pointed pawns from shogi. The pieces are lined up on the back rank of each player's side. That's it. No king, no queen, no special powers. Every piece is a soldier. The goal is simple: capture all or almost all of your opponent's pieces. A player wins if they capture 8 of the 9 enemy pieces. The movement is also simple. On your turn, you can move any one of your pieces any number of squares horizontally or vertically, just like a rook in chess. But you cannot jump over other pieces, friendly or enemy. The board quickly fills up, creating walls and blocking lanes. The capture is where the game gets its name and its character. It uses the same custodial capture we saw in Insidiae. To capture an enemy piece, you must trap it between 2 of your own pieces. This can happen horizontally or vertically. You move your piece into position, and any enemy pieces that are now sandwiched between the piece you just moved and another one of your pieces are captured and removed from the board. It feels like closing a pair of scissors. Snap. This leads to a very different kind of strategy. You are constantly looking for opportunities to create these traps. You might sacrifice a piece to lure your opponent into a position where you can then perform a multiple capture. A long line of enemy pieces can be wiped out in a single move if you can plug both ends. It's a game of lines and formations. You build up your own lines to be safe from capture, while probing for weaknesses in your opponent's lines. The game is thought to have emerged during the Heian period, 794 to 1185 AD in Japan, a time of great artistic and cultural development. It was a game for samurai and commoners alike. Its simplicity made it easy to learn, but its strategic depth made it difficult to master. Unlike the hierarchical world of shogi or chess, with its powerful kings and queens, Hasami Shogi is democratic. Every piece is equal. It's a game of teamwork and formation, reflecting the importance of the infantry unit in Japanese warfare. The game is still played today. It's often used to teach children the basics of shogi, as it introduces the board and the idea of strategic thinking without the complexity of different piece types. But it stands on its own as a brilliant and elegant game. It proves that you don't need a lot of complicated rules to create a deep and engaging experience. Sometimes the most interesting games are the ones with the fewest moving parts. We know the modern rules, but how has the game evolved over the centuries? Were there variants played on different sized boards? The standard rule is to capture 8 pieces, but was there ever a version where you had to capture all 9, leading to tense endgame situations with one lone soldier trying to survive? And did samurai warriors use the game to teach tactical formations to young soldiers, using the simple pieces to represent entire units on a battlefield? Number 15. How can a game be a circle? Most games are about moving forward. You start at one end of the board and try to get to the other. But what if the board had no beginning and no end? What if it was a circle? This is the idea behind a game that was incredibly popular in the Middle Ages, known as Merrill's or the Mill game. It's actually a variant of Nine Men's Morris, but its circular board gives it a unique feel and a different kind of strategic flow. The game was played on a board made of 3 concentric squares or circles connected by lines from the center outwards. The game is for 2 players, each with a set of pieces, usually 9. The game is played in 3 phases. In the first phase, players take turns placing their pieces, one at a time, on any of the 24 intersection points on the board. The goal during this phase is to get 3 of your pieces in a row along one of the lines. This is called a mill. When you form a mill, you get to do something very powerful. You can remove one of your opponent's pieces from the board. Any piece can be removed, as long as it is not part of a mill itself. This makes the placement phase incredibly tense. You are not just trying to build your own mills, you are desperately trying to block your opponent from forming theirs. Once all the pieces are on the board, the second phase begins. Players now take turns moving one of their pieces one step along a line to an adjacent empty point. The goal is still the same: form a mill and remove an opponent's piece. This phase is a strategic dance. You are constantly shifting your pieces, trying to create a situation where you can form a mill on one turn, and then maybe move one piece out and back in on a future turn to form it again. Setting up a running mill like this is a key to victory. The game ends when one player is reduced to only 2 pieces, as they can no longer form a mill. Or if a player is blocked and has no legal moves, the game is elegant and brutal. A single mistake can cost you a piece, and losing a piece is a huge disadvantage. We find boards for Merrill's and Nine Men's Morris scratched into all sorts of places. They are on the cloister seats of English cathedrals, like Norwich and Salisbury, carved by board monks. They are found on flagstones in ancient Roman forums. A board was even found in the Gokstad Viking burial ship dating to the 9th century. Shakespeare mentions the Nine Men's Morris is filled up with mud in A Midsummer Night's Dream, showing that it was a common outdoor game played by digging holes in the turf. The circular nature of some boards changes the feel of the game. There are no corners in the traditional sense, which are often powerful positions on a square board. Every position feels more connected. The game flows. It's less about holding a fortress and more about controlling the lines of movement. It's a game that could be played with anything. 2 players could just draw the board in the dirt and use stones as pieces. It was a universal pastime. The name Morris is a mystery. Does it have some connection to Morris dancing or the Moors? Scholars are divided. The game is ancient, predating the medieval period, but it was at its peak of popularity then. Why did it fade away? Was it simply too abstract for a world that was becoming more interested in the narrative-rich game of chess? And when a monk carved that board into his seat at Norwich Cathedral, was he thinking about strategy, or was he just trying to stay awake during a long sermon? Number 14, how do you play a game found in a tomb? In 1922, the archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating the royal cemetery of Ur in modern-day Iraq. In the tombs of ancient Sumerian kings and queens dating back to 2600 BC, he found something extraordinary. He found several beautifully crafted game boards. This was the royal game of Ur. Now, this is an ancient game, not a medieval one, but it survived. It was played for thousands of years across multiple civilizations, and its descendants were still being played well into the medieval period. It's a vital part of the story. The board is shaped a bit like the number 8. It has 2 blocks of squares connected by a narrow bridge. The boards found in were masterpieces of craftsmanship inlaid with shell, bone, and lapis lazuli. The game pieces were discs, and they also found tetrahedral dice, which are shaped like four-sided pyramids. This tells us something crucial. The game involved both skill and luck. For decades, no one knew how to play it. The rules were lost. It was a silent artifact. Then, in the early 1980s, a curator at the British Museum named Irving Finkel made a breakthrough. He was studying a clay tablet from Babylon, dating to 177 BC. The tablet was a set of rules for a game. He realized the board described on the tablet was the same as the one found at He had found the instructions. The royal game of is a race game. Each player has 7 pieces. The goal is to get all of your pieces onto the board, travel along a specific path, and then bear them off the other side. The roll of the dice determines how many spaces you can move a piece. The path is convoluted. Pieces from both players share the same track for part of the journey, which means you can land on an opponent's piece and send it back to the start. Some of the squares on the board are marked with a rosette. Landing on a rosette square is lucky. It gives you another roll of the dice. It's a safe square, meaning your piece cannot be captured there. This adds a layer of strategy. Do you try to race past your opponent, or do you play a slower, safer game trying to control the rosette squares? The game spread from Mesopotamia across the ancient world. It was played in Egypt, Cyprus, India, and beyond. It changed its shape and its rules as it traveled. One of its direct descendants is a game that was still being played by the Jewish community in Kochi, India in the 20th century. This version was called Asha. The board was slightly different, but the core mechanics were the same. This incredible longevity shows what a powerful design it was. By the medieval period, games like this were everywhere. They belonged to a family of games called tables games, which includes backgammon. The Roman game tabula was a direct descendant. The idea of a race game, governed by the roll of dice but guided by player choice, was a fundamental part of the medieval gaming landscape. It reflected a worldview where both fate, the dice, and free will, your moves determined your destiny. Irving Finkel's translation is our best guide, but it's from a period almost 2,500 years after the boards were made. How much did the rules change in that time? What did the 5 different rosette designs on the original board signify? Were they just decoration, or did each one have a different special power that has been lost to time? And what did it feel like to be an ancient king, believing that the roll of the dice was a message from the gods themselves? Number 13. What if you played a game with numbers instead of soldiers? Imagine a board game so complex, so intellectually demanding, that it was used to teach philosophy, mathematics, and music theory. A game with no luck at all. A game where every move was a calculation. This was Rithmomachy, also known as the Philosopher's Game. It was probably the most difficult and intellectually prestigious board game of the Middle Ages. And Rithmomachy was played on a board that looked like 2 chessboards stuck together, a rectangle of 8 by 16 squares. The pieces were not kings, knights, or pawns. They were numbers. The pieces were shaped like circles, triangles, and squares. Each piece had a number written on it. One side had even numbers, the other had odd numbers. The game was a battle between even and odd. The goal was to achieve one of several types of victory. These victories were not as simple as capturing a king. They were based on complex numerical relationships. For example, you could win by arranging 3 of your pieces in a row so that their numbers formed an arithmetic progression like 2, 4, 6. Or you could arrange 4 pieces to form a harmonic or geometric progression. This was a game for people who understood Boythian music theory and Pythagorean mathematics. The movement and capture rules were just as complicated. How a piece could move depended on the number written on it. A circular piece could move 1 square, a triangular piece could move 2, and a square piece could move 3. Capture was even more mind-bending. There were multiple ways to capture an opponent's piece. You could capture by meeting, where your piece lands on the opponent's square. But you could also capture by assault, where the number on your piece multiplied by the number of empty squares between it and the target equaled the number on the target piece. There was also capture by siege, where you surrounded a piece so it couldn't move. This was not a game for the faint of heart. It was created in the 11th century, likely in a monastery in southern Germany. We have manuscripts describing the rules from figures like the monk Asilo of Würzburg. It became popular in intellectual circles. It was taught in cathedral schools and early universities. It was seen as a mental workout, a way to train the mind in the principles of cosmic order. The medieval worldview was obsessed with the idea that the universe was structured by divine mathematical and harmonic ratios. Arithmomachy was a playable model of that universe. The game required intense concentration. Players would have had to do complex mental arithmetic with every single move. It's a game that is almost impossible to imagine playing in a noisy tavern. This was a game for the quiet of a library or a scriptorium. It was the ultimate nerd game of its day. Arithmomachy's complexity was also its downfall. It was too difficult for most people to learn. As the medieval period ended and the Renaissance began, intellectual fashions changed. The game began to seem old-fashioned and overly scholastic. It was gradually forgotten, replaced by the more accessible but still strategic game of chess. Today, only a handful of dedicated historians and game enthusiasts know how to play it. We have the rules, but do we understand the strategy? What does a good opening move in Arithmomachy even look like? The game was meant to teach philosophy, but did playing it actually make you a better philosopher or just better at arithmetic? And is it possible that the insane complexity was part of the point, a way for intellectuals to create a pastime so exclusive that only they could understand and enjoy it? Number 12, how did a Viking king escape his enemies? This is the quintessential game of the Viking Age. It's called Hnefatafl. The name means King's Table. You know, it's not one single game, but a whole family of games played across Northern Europe from about 400 AD until the rise of chess around the 12th century. It's a game of war, but unlike chess, the two sides are not equal. It's a game of siege and escape. Hnefatafl is played on a gridded board, usually 11 by 11 or 13 by 13. One player has a king and a small number of defenders. They start in the center of the board, in a fortress or throne square. The other player has a much larger army of attackers, usually twice the number of defenders. The attackers start positioned around the edges of the board. All pieces move like a rook in chess, any number of empty squares horizontally or vertically. The objectives are completely different for each side. The king's player wins if the king can escape to any of the four corner squares. The attacker's player wins if they can capture the king. Capturing Hnefatafl is custodial. An ordinary piece is captured if it is sandwiched between two enemy pieces either horizontally or vertically. The king is stronger. He usually needs to be surrounded on all four sides to be captured. Playing Hnefatafl feels like being in a movie. If you are the king, you feel hunted. You are surrounded from the start. Your defenders are a small elite bodyguard. You have to make sacrifices. You have to create an opening, a path for the king to break through the enemy line and make a desperate sprint for the corner. It is tense and dramatic. If you are the attacker, you have the numbers, but you need to be coordinated. You have to close the net. You need to plug the gaps and slowly tighten the noose around the king's dwindling forces. A single mistake can let the king slip through your grasp. We have found Hnefatafl boards in many archaeological digs. A famous one was found in the Gokstad ship burial in Norway, a 9th century Viking longship. The pieces were made of wood, bone, or even glass. The Lewis Chessman, a famous set of 12th century game pieces found in Scotland, probably contains pieces for both chess and Hnefatafl. The game is mentioned in the Norse sagas. It was the game of chieftains and kings. There were many regional variations. In Ireland, a version called Brandub was played on a 7x7 board. In Wales, they played Talbot on an 11x11 board. The rules were slightly different in each place. For example, in some versions, the king could be captured by only two pieces if he was next to the central throne square. Why did Hnefatafl die out? The arrival of chess was the main reason. Chess was a new, exciting game from the East. It was symmetrical, which perhaps felt more fair or modern. It had a whole culture and literature attached to it. Hnefatafl, the old game of the Vikings, slowly faded into obscurity. It was only in the 20th century that historians and game enthusiasts began to reconstruct the rules and bring it back to life. We have reconstructed the rules from various historical sources and archaeological finds. But are they perfect? The Norse sagas mention special dice rolls and moves that don't fit our modern understanding of the game. Were there elements of luck we have completely missed? Was the king allowed a special jump move that is not recorded in any surviving text? And What unspoken strategies did a Viking Jarl teach his son over a game of Nefertafall? Lessons about sacrifice, courage, and the art of the breakout. Number 11. Can a game tell the future? In Ireland, a land rich with myth and legend, there was a game called Fidchel. It's mentioned in some of the oldest Irish texts, like the epic tale of Cuchulainn. It was said to be a game of the nobility, a game of kings, but Fidchel is shrouded in mystery. We know it existed, we know it was important, but we don't know for sure how it was played. From the text, we can piece together a few clues. The name might mean wood wisdom or wood sense. It was played on a square board with an equal number of pieces on each side. A key piece in the center was called the Brannan, or king. The game seems to have had a supernatural element. In some stories, the board would play by itself. In others, the outcome of a game of Fidchel would foretell the outcome of a real battle. It was not just a game, it was a form of divination. Many scholars believe that Fidchel was a type of tafal game, similar to the Welsh Talbordud or the Norse Nefatafal. This makes sense. It would have an asymmetrical setup with a king in the center trying to escape from a larger force. This fits the descriptions in the myths. The game was often presented as a gift between kings or as part of a bride's dowry. It was a high-status object, a beautifully made Fidchel set was a sign of wealth and intelligence. The archaeologist R.A.S. McAllister in the 1930s promoted the idea that a specific gridded stone board found at Tara, the ancient seat of the High Kings of Ireland, was a Fidchel board. While this is debated, it captures the imagination. The idea of Irish kings playing this strategic, mystical game at their ceremonial heartland is powerful. But other theories exist. Some suggest Fidchel was more like Nine Men's Morris, a game of alignment. Others believe it was something else entirely, a game whose rules are now completely lost. The references in the texts are often poetic and vague. They talk about the men of Fidchel being arranged for battle, which supports the Tafel theory. But the details of movement and capture are missing. Like, this uncertainty is what makes Fidchel so fascinating. It represents the gaps in our knowledge. We have the name, we have the legends. We have a sense of its cultural importance. But the game itself is a ghost. Modern reconstructions are educated guesses. We can create a playable game based on the Tafel model that we call Fidchel, and it's a lot of fun. But we can never be sure if we are playing the same game that Cuchulainn played. The game's connection to divination is particularly interesting. For the ancient Irish, the world was not a random place. It was filled with signs and portents. The flight of a bird, the shape of a cloud, the outcome of a game all, could be read as messages from the other world. A game of Fidchel wasn't just a contest between two players. It was a way of asking the universe a question. The winner was not just the better strategist, they were the one favored by fate. If Fidchel was a Tafal game, what made it uniquely Irish? Did it have special rules related to Irish mythology, perhaps involving the powers of certain gods or heroes? If it wasn't a Tafal game, what else could it have been? Could it have been a race game like the Royal Game of Ur, but with an Irish twist? And the most tantalizing question, is there a manuscript sitting forgotten in a library somewhere, a monk's diary, or a collection of poems that contains the complete, unambiguous rules for this lost game of kings? Number 10. What was chess like before the queen became a superhero? Everyone knows chess. It's the king of board games. But the game we play today is a modern version. Medieval chess was a different beast. It was slower, more methodical, and in some ways more realistic. It was called Shatranj, and it came to Europe from the Persian Empire around the 9th century. Shatranj is the direct ancestor of modern chess. It was played on an 8x8 board. It had a king Shah, a piece that moved like a rook, a knight Asb, and pawns Piade. But some of the most powerful pieces in our modern game were much weaker in Shatranj. The queen was not a queen. It was a counselor or general Furzin, and it was a very weak piece. It could only move one square diagonally in any direction. The bishop was also different. It was an elephant pill, and it could only move exactly 2 squares diagonally, and it could jump over the piece in between. This changed the game completely. The opening of a Shatranj game was very slow. Right, with no powerful queen or long-range bishops, it took many moves to bring your pieces into contact with the enemy. The game was less about sudden, dramatic attacks and more about slowly improving your position. It was a game of attrition. Pawns were even more important because they were harder to attack from a distance. The goal was also slightly different. You could win by checkmate, just like in modern chess. But you could also win by barring the king, which meant capturing all of his defending pieces, leaving him alone on the board. This was considered a lesser type of victory, a bit like winning on points. You could also win if you stalemated your opponent, which is a draw in modern chess. In Shatranj, forcing a stalemate was a legitimate way to win. Shatranj was a game of the educated and the elite. It was popular in the great Islamic courts of Baghdad and Cordoba. Great players wrote books about it, studying openings and endgame problems, much like modern chess grandmasters. One of the most famous players was Al-Suli, a 10th century master whose skill was legendary. He was said to be able to play blindfolded. When the game came to Europe through Spain and Italy, it began to change. The Europeans were impatient, they found the slow pace of Shatranj frustrating. Around the 15th century, a series of rule changes, now called the Mad Queen's Chess, transformed the game. The counselor became the queen and was given its modern, incredibly powerful movement. The elephant became the bishop and was allowed to move any number of squares along a diagonal. These changes supercharged the game. It became faster, more tactical, and more exciting. This new version is the one we play today. Playing Shatranj feels like stepping back in time. It forces you to be patient. You have to appreciate the subtle power of a well-placed pawn. You learn that a coordinated attack with several small pieces can be more effective than a single powerful one. It's a game that reflects a different time, a different pace of life. Why did the rules of chess change so dramatically in 15th century Europe? Was it just a desire for a faster game, or did the rise of powerful female monarchs like Queen Isabella of Spain influence the transformation of the weak Ferzan into the all-powerful queen? The term for the elephant, alfil, became often in French, and eventually the bishop, in English. But why a bishop? What is the connection between an elephant and a clergyman? And did the old masters like Al-Suli ever dream that their subtle game of position would one day become a high-speed battle of tactical annihilation? Number 9, can you win a war on a tiny board? We've talked about the epic scale of Nefatafal on a large board, but not all Tafel games were so grand. In Ireland, they played a smaller, faster, and arguably more brutal version of the game called Brandub. The name means Black Raven. It was played on a small 7x7 board. This small size completely changes the dynamics of the game. In Brandub, the defender has a king, the Brahmin, and 4 defenders. They start in the center of the board, arranged in a cross. The attacker has 8 pieces, arranged in groups of 2 on the 4 sides of the board. The goal is the same as in Nefatafal. The king must escape to a corner, and the attackers must capture him. All pieces move like rooks, and capture is custodial, but the 7x7 board makes everything feel claustrophobic. The attackers are on top of the king. From the very first move, there is no time for slow development or complex maneuvering. The game is a knife fight in a phone booth. Every single move is critical. The king's player must be aggressive. They have to break out immediately, using their defenders to create a path. The attacker's player must be ruthlessly efficient, closing every possible escape route. We know about Brandub from several sources. There are archaeological finds of 7x7 boards in Ireland, particularly at sites associated with monasteries and high-status settlements. The game is also mentioned in Irish texts. A key piece of evidence is the Ballinderry game board, a wooden board found in a crannog, an artificial island dwelling dating from the 10th century. It's a beautifully carved 7x7 board, clearly made for a high-stakes game. The smaller size of Brandub likely made it a more common game than its larger cousins. A 7x7 board is easy to scratch into a piece of wood or stone. It's a game you could play quickly. 2 games of Brandub could be played in the time it took to play one half of a Nefatafal game. It was the perfect game for a quick break or a wager. Playing Brandub today is a fascinating exercise in efficiency. The balance of the game is incredibly delicate. For a long time, modern reconstructions made the game seem heavily biased towards the attacker. It felt almost impossible for the king to escape. However, more recent research into the historical sources, particularly by the World Tafel Federation, has suggested rule refinements, such as giving the king the power to capture on his own, which balance the game and make it a tense, fair fight. Brandub shows the adaptability of a great game idea. The core concept of the Tafel family asymmetrical forces, siege, and escape app is so strong that it works on boards of many different sizes. Each size creates a completely different experience. Brandub is the sprinter, while Nefatafal is the marathon runner. The name Brandub, Black Raven, is evocative. Does it refer to the color of the game pieces? Or is it a reference to the raven as a symbol of war and death in Celtic mythology, a fitting name for such a combative game? We have found the boards, but the pieces are often just generic pegs, where the king pieces in high-status sets ornately carved, perhaps in the shape of a king or a raven. And how many disputes in medieval Irish pubs were settled not with fists, but with a lightning-fast, brutal game of brand-up. Number 8. How do you play a game with 3 rows of letters? Before there was backgammon, there was tabula, and before there was tabula, there was ludus duodecim scriptorum, the game of 12 markings. This was the game of choice for Roman legionaries and emperors alike. It was a race game, played on a board with 3 rows of 12 squares or points. Often these squares were replaced with letters forming six-letter words, and ludus duodecim scriptorum is a direct ancestor of backgammon. Each player had 15 pieces. The movement of the pieces was determined by the roll of 3 6-sided dice. The goal was to be the first player to get all of your pieces from the start along a prescribed path across the 3 rows and off the end of the board. Like backgammon, you could land on a square occupied by a single enemy piece A below and send it back to the beginning. The boards that have survived are fascinating. They often have phrases spelled out in the squares. A common one is Virtus imperi hostes victos ludite Romani, which means virtue of the empire, the enemy is defeated, play on, Romans. Another popular one was levate doloku luder nessis idiota recede, bit of trash talk. That means get up from the table, you don't know how to play, you idiot, get lost. The game was woven into the fabric of Roman social life. It was a way to boast, to insult, and to pass the time. The exact path the pieces took is a subject of some debate among historians. However, by studying the layout of the boards and working backward from the rules of its successor, tabula, a plausible set of rules has been reconstructed by scholars like R.C. Bell in his book Board and Table Games from Many Civilizations. The game was a mix of luck from the dice and skill in choosing which pieces to move. You had to decide when to play it safe and build up strong points, and when to take a risk and leave a piece vulnerable. The game was hugely popular. The Emperor Claudius was said to be an obsessive player. Even wrote a book about it, which is now lost tragically. He supposedly had a special board built into his chariot so he could play while traveling. This shows that it wasn't just a game for idle soldiers, it was a passion for the highest levels of society. Sometime around the 5th or 6th century, the game evolved. The middle row of the board was removed, leaving just the 2 outer rows. This streamlined the game, creating the board layout we now know as backgammon. This new version was called Tabula, and it was the dominant race game of the early medieval period. But the spirit of ludus duodecim scriptorum, the game of the 12 markings, lived on in its descendant. Why did the Romans use letters and phrases on their boards? Was it just decoration, or did the specific words have some meaning in the game itself? We lost Claudius's book on the game, but what secrets of high-level strategy did it contain? Did he have favorite opening moves or theories about probability? And what was the most creative 6-letter phrase ever used on a custom-made board by a trash-talking Roman senator? Number 7. How can a simple grid be so tricky? You have probably seen this game without knowing what it was. It's a simple grid of 9 dots connected by lines. It's often found carved into old stones or wooden benches. This is allegorical. It is the direct ancestor of draughts or checkers, but it's a game with a much longer and more global history. The standard allegorical board is a square grid of 5 by 5 points, with extra diagonal lines connecting the dots. Each player has 12 pieces. They are set up on the board, filling the first 2 rows on each player's side, plus the 2 rightmost points on the central row. The very center of the board is left empty. The rules are simple and will be familiar to anyone who has played checkers. On your turn, you can move one of your pieces 1 step along the line to an adjacent empty point. The capture rule is what makes the game. You capture an opponent's piece by jumping over it to an empty space on the other side. You can chain jumps together. If, after 1 jump, your piece is in a position to jump another enemy piece, you can do so in the same turn. The goal is to capture all of your opponent's pieces. Allegorical is a game of pure strategy. There is no luck. The board, with its extra diagonal lines, makes for a very dynamic game. Pieces have more movement options than in early forms of checkers. The game is all about setting up traps. You want to lure your opponent into a position where you can execute a devastating series of jumps. You have to be careful not to leave your own pieces vulnerable. The game is ancient. A board that looks very much like an allegorical board has been found on a roof tile of a temple in Kurna, Egypt, dating back to 1400 BC. But the game, as we know it, really came to prominence in the medieval period. It was brought to Spain by the Moors. The name Alquerque comes from the Arabic Alkirk. Our best source for the medieval rules is the Libro de los Juegos, the Book of Games, a magnificent manuscript commissioned in the 13th century by Alfonso X, the King of Castile. This book is a treasure trove of information about medieval games. It describes the rules for chess, dice games, and Alquerque. The beautiful illustrations show Christian, Muslim, and Jewish players sitting together, enjoying the games. It's a testament to the power of games to cross cultural divides. Sometime in the 12th or 13th century in France, someone had a brilliant idea. They took the rules of Alquerque with its jump capture mechanic and decided to play it on a chessboard. They also restricted the pieces to the dark squares. This new game was called Fierges. This was the birth of draughts. The new game was a hit and eventually overshadowed its parent. But Alquerque continued to be played for centuries in Spain and other parts of the world. The ancient Egyptian board at Kurna looks like Alquerque, but can we be sure they played the same game? Is it possible two different cultures independently invented a similar pattern for a completely different purpose? The Libro de los Juegos gives us one set of rules, but were there popular variations in the medieval world with different setups or special king pieces? And what was it about the jump capture mechanic that proved so compelling it has survived for over 3,000 years? Number 6, what happens when a fox fights a flock of geese? Most strategy games are symmetrical. Two equal armies face off. But medieval Europe was fascinated by a different kind of conflict, the hunt. This fascination gave rise to a whole family of asymmetrical hunt games. One of the most popular was Fox and Geese. The game is played on a cross-shaped board, usually made of 33 points connected by lines. One player plays as the fox. They have only one piece. The other player plays as the geese. They have a larger number of pieces, typically between 13 and 17. The game starts with the geese arranged on one side of the board and the fox placed in the center. The objectives are completely different. The geese win if they can trap the fox so that it has no legal moves. The fox wins if it can eat enough geese so that they can no longer form a trap. The movement is simple. The geese can only move one step forward or sideways along a line. They cannot move backward. The fox can move one step in any direction along a line. The capture rule is only for the fox. The fox captures a goose using the familiar jump capture from Alquerque. If a goose is adjacent to the fox and the space on the other side is empty, the fox can jump over the goose and remove it from the board. The fox can chain these jumps together, eating multiple geese in a single bloody turn. Playing fox and geese is a lesson in two different kinds of thinking. As the geese, you have the power of numbers. You must move as a coordinated flock. You have to slowly build a wall, a net, to trap the fox. You have to be willing to sacrifice a goose or two to plug a gap. It's a slow, patient game of constriction. As the fox, you are fast and deadly. You have to stay mobile. You must constantly probe the geese's formation, looking for a weak point, a single goose out of position. You need to create opportunities for a multi-jump that can tear a hole in their line. Games of this type were popular all over medieval Europe. Boards have been found carved into the decks of Viking ships and the seats of English cathedrals. The game was known by many names. In Iceland, it was called Freys Tafel. In Britain, it was simply Fox and Geese. The concept of the one versus many was a powerful one. It reflected stories of heroic knights fighting off hordes of enemies or of clever animals outwitting their hunters. The game is still played today as a folk game in many parts of the world. It's a testament to a simple but brilliant design. It teaches valuable strategic lessons about coordination, sacrifice, and recognizing opportunities. It's a game that is easy to learn, but offers a surprising amount of depth. The number of geese varies in different traditions. How does changing the number from 13 to 15 to 17 completely alter the balance of the game? Was there a perfect number that was considered standard in the medieval period? We call it fox and geese, but were there other versions with different themes, like a dragon and a flock of sheep, or a wolf and a group of hunters? And when children played this game, did they cheer for the clever fox or the unified, determined geese? Number 5, could a game have an unbeatable strategy? This game is so simple you can learn it in a minute, but it's so deep that people have been studying its strategy for centuries. It's called Nine Men's Morris. We've already mentioned its cousin Merrill's, but the classic square-board version deserves its own spot. It was, without a doubt, one of the most widespread and beloved games of the medieval world. The board is made of 3 concentric squares connected by 4 lines, creating 24 intersection points. Each of the 2 players has 9 pieces, or men. The game proceeds in 3 phases, just like Merrill's. First, players take turns placing their 9 men on any empty point. If a player gets 3 of their men in a row, a mill, they get to remove one of the opponent's men. Once all 18 men are on the board, the second phase begins. Players take turns sliding one of their men to an adjacent empty point. Again, the goal is to form a mill and remove an opponent's piece. The game becomes a tense battle of blocking and maneuvering. The ultimate goal is to set up a situation where you can open one mill to create another one on your next turn, allowing you to systematically destroy your opponent's forces. The third phase is a special rule for when a player is reduced to only 3 men. This player's men are now allowed to fly or hop to any empty point on the board, not just an adjacent one. This gives the losing player a last-ditch chance to create a mill and turn the tide of the game. The game ends when one player has fewer than 3 men left or is unable to make a legal move. The game is ancient, with boards found dating back to the Roman Empire and possibly even further. But it was in the medieval period that it reached its peak. It was a game for everyone. Monks carved it into their seats in cathedrals, like the famous examples in Canterbury and Gloucester. Soldiers scratched it onto shields. Farmers drew it in the dirt. It required no special equipment, just a board and some stones. The strategy of Nine Men's Morris is fascinating. In 1993, the computer scientist Ralph Gasser proved that, with perfect play from both sides, the game will always end in a draw. This means that if you know what you are doing, you can never be beaten. But perfect play is incredibly difficult for a human to achieve. The game tree is vast. A single mistake can be fatal. The game is all about forcing your opponent to make that one crucial error. The game's popularity declined after the medieval period, but it never completely vanished. It survived as a folk game passed down through generations. Today, it's easy to find sets in game stores or to play it online. It remains one of the most elegant and perfectly balanced abstract strategy games ever created. We know the game was solved by a computer, but did any medieval masters come close to figuring out the perfect strategy? Were there unwritten treatises or secrets passed from master to apprentice? The flying rule for the last 3 pieces is not universal. Was this a later addition to the game to make it more exciting, or was it part of the original design? And what is the origin of the name Morris? Is it a corruption of Moorish or something else entirely, a secret lost to the mists of time? Number 4, how did a Roman emperor lose a game with one bad roll? Backgammon is one of the oldest games still played today. Its medieval form was called tabula, which simply means board or table. It was the game of nobles, merchants, and gamblers across Europe and the Middle East for centuries. It was a direct evolution of the Roman ludus duodecim scriptorum, played on a board that looks almost identical to a modern backgammon board. Tabula is a game for 2 players with 15 checkers each. The board has 24 points, or triangles. The players move their checkers in opposite directions along a U-shaped track. The movement is dictated by the roll of 2 dice, though sometimes 3 were used. The goal is to be the first to move all 15 of your checkers into your home board, and then bear them off or remove them from the board. Like modern backgammon, tabula had the concepts of hitting and re-entering. If you land a checker on a point occupied by only one of your opponent's checkers A, blot, that checker is hit and sent to the bar in the middle of the board. The opponent must then use a dice roll to re-enter that checker onto your side of the board before they can move any of their other pieces. This adds a huge element of risk and strategy to the game. One of the most famous stories about tabula involves the Byzantine Emperor Zeno, who reigned in the 5th century. A text from that period describes a specific game he was playing. Zeno was in a very strong position, but he got a terrible roll of the dice, a 2, a 5, and a 6. This roll forced him to break up several of his strong points, leaving them vulnerable. The text meticulously describes the bad position this one unlucky roll put him in. This story shows how much the game was a part of elite culture. It was a game of skill, but everyone, even an emperor, was still at the mercy of fate. Tabula was a game of probabilities and risk management. You had to know when to play safe and when to attack. You had to decide whether to race your checkers home as fast as possible or to play a blocking game, creating a prime, a wall of 6 consecutive points to trap your opponent's checkers. The game was sometimes frowned upon by the church because of its association with gambling. Many a sermon was preached against the evils of dice and the tables, but this did little to stop its popularity. Alfonso X's Libro de los Juegos describes several variants of tabula, showing its richness and diversity in 13th century Spain. It was the ultimate medieval tavern game, a perfect mix of luck and skill to pass the time and wager a few coins. The doubling cube, a key feature of modern backgammon that allows players to raise the stakes, was not invented until the 20th century. How did medieval players manage betting without it? Were there complex systems of side bets and wagers that we have lost? The story of Emperor Zeno's bad roll is incredibly specific. Was it a real event recorded by a courtier, or was it a famous game problem created by a master player to teach a strategic lesson? And did the sound of dice rattling in a wooden cup become the soundtrack of medieval nightlife? Number 3. What if a game was meant to be unfinished? This is perhaps the most obscure game on the list. It's a game we only know from a single enigmatic description by a Roman scholar. It's called Ludus Latrunculorum, or the Game of Little Soldiers. It was the premier strategy game of the Roman military, played from the days of the Republic to the late Empire, and its influence certainly bled into the early medieval period. The problem with Latrunculorum is that, while Roman writers like Varro and Ovid mention it frequently, none of them bothered to write down a complete set of rules. They all assumed their readers already knew how to play. It's like trying to learn how to play poker by only reading newspaper columns that mention someone had a full house. That terminology, but not the grammar. Here's what we think we know. It was a game of pure strategy for 2 players, played on a grid, usually 8x8 or 8x12. Each player had an equal number of pieces, all of the same type, except for one special piece called the dux, or general. The pieces were called latrones or milites, the soldiers. The goal was likely to capture the opponent's dux, or to immobilize their forces. The key mechanic seems to have been custodial capture, just like in Hennefaufel or Insidiae. A regular piece was captured by being trapped between 2 enemy pieces. This is the one detail that is mentioned most consistently. The role of the dux is the biggest mystery. Was it just a king piece that needed to be captured? Or did it have special movement powers? Was it stronger, or was it a vulnerability? Modern reconstructions, pioneered by scholars like R.C. Bell and Ulrich Schadler, have created playable versions of the game. These versions are often compelling strategy games, but we can never be certain they are historically accurate. The game feels like a Roman general's training tool. It's not about a single heroic charge, it's about forming lines, controlling territory, cutting off supply routes by trapping pieces, and protecting your commander. It's a game of formation and logistics. When the Roman Empire collapsed, Latrunculorum seems to have faded away. The Tafel games of the barbarian, peoples who succeeded the Romans, used a similar capture mechanic, but their asymmetrical setup was a completely different strategic challenge. Latrunculorum, the game of balanced Roman legions, was lost in the shuffle of history. Playing a reconstructed version of Latrunculorum feels like practicing archaeology. You are trying to breathe life into something that is only partially there. The game's silence is its most powerful feature. It reminds us that history is full of holes, of things we can never fully know. The dux is the key. What did it do? Was it the only piece that could move long distances? Or was it a weak piece that had to be protected at all costs, making it a liability rather than an asset? Roman sources sometimes mention dice being used in conjunction with the game. Was there a variant that involved luck, or are the authors confusing it with other games? And is it possible that the game was so intuitive to a Roman mind, so perfectly reflective of their military tactics, that they simply couldn't imagine a world where the rules needed to be written down? Number 2, how did a simple house become a casino? Not all games were about deep strategy or military tactics. Some were just about rolling dice and hoping for the best. Luck House, or House of Luck, was a popular dice game in medieval Germany and Central Europe. It wasn't just a game of chance, it was a physical board that turned a simple dice roll into a communal event. The Gluckhaus board was a simple wooden tray with different numbered compartments. The numbers usually ran from 2 to 12. Some of the numbers had special meanings. The number 7 was often a wedding, a lucky spot. The number 12 might be the king, the ultimate prize. The number 2 was often the pig or joker, a losing spot. The game was simple. Players would take turns rolling two six-sided dice. The total of the dice would determine what happened. If you rolled an 8, you would either place a coin in the number 8 compartment or take the coins that were already there depending on the house rules. The goal was to win the coins. The special compartments made it interesting. If you rolled a 7 and the wedding compartment was empty, you had to place a coin there. This was your wedding gift. If it was already full, you took all the coins in it. This was your wedding present. If you rolled a 12, the king, you won all the coins on the entire board except for those in the wedding compartment. The game would then reset. If you rolled a 2, the pig, you had to pay a penalty putting coins into several of the other compartments. Gluckhaus was a game of pure luck. There was no skill involved, but that was the point. It was a simple, fast-paced way to gamble. It was a perfect tavern game. It created drama and excitement with every roll of the dice. You could be losing all night, and then one roll of a 12 could make you the big winner. The board itself was a piece of folk art. They were often brightly painted with pictures of a king, a pig, or a wedding scene in the different compartments. The game reflects the social life of the time. It was a communal activity. The pot of money on the board belonged to everyone and no one. It was a shared pool of risk and reward. The game is a reminder that games don't have to be complicated to be fun. The simple act of rolling dice and hoping for a good outcome is a powerful and enduring form of entertainment. Gluckhaus was the medieval slot machine, a simple engine for turning hope and luck into coins. We know the general rules, but the special numbers and their effects varied from region to region. What were some of the other special squares? Was there a thief square that let you steal from another player? Or a pilgrim square that made you immune for one round? The boards are now collector's items, but how many were crudely made, with the numbers just burned into the wood with a hot poker? And how many times did a lucky roll of the dice in a game of Gluckhaus genuinely change someone's life, even if just for one night? Number 1, can you play a game for 5,000 years? We end where we began with a question of survival. Of all the games on this list, which one has the best claim to being the oldest continuously played board game in the world? Many would argue it is the game known to the Romans as tabula, to the Persians as nard, and to us as backgammon. But its ancestor, the royal game of Ur, has a 5,000-year history. Its cousin, Nine Men's Morris, is found carved into stones from the Bronze Age. These games are not medieval inventions, they are survivors. The medieval period was not an end or a beginning for board games. It was a crucible. It was a time when ancient games from Rome, Egypt, and Persia met the new games of the Vikings and the Celts. It was a time when a game like Shatranj could travel from India to Baghdad to Spain and be transformed along the way. It was a time when a king like Alfonso X could see the value in recording these pastimes, preserving them for us to study today. The games we've looked at are a mirror. They show us a world that was, in some ways, very different from our own. A world where a game could be a tool for teaching theology, a form of divination, or a training exercise for war. But they also show us a world that was strikingly familiar, a world where people wanted to test their minds, to take a chance, to laugh with their friends, and to beat their rivals. These forgotten games are not just historical curiosities, they are playable pieces of history. To set up a Nefertafel board is to connect with a Viking warrior. To roll the dice for tabula is to share a moment with a Roman emperor. Then they are a reminder that the fundamental human desire to play, to create order and challenge out of a simple set of rules, is one of the most ancient and enduring parts of who we are. They were not forgotten because they weren't fun. They were just pushed aside by new ideas. But they are still there, waiting to be rediscovered. Of all the thousands of games that must have been played in the medieval period, how many have been lost without a single trace? Not even a name. If we were to discover a new manuscript tomorrow, a book of games from a different culture, what completely unknown types of games might we find? And perhaps the most important question of all, if a medieval person could sit down and play one of our modern board games, what would they think of us, and what would the game we chose to show them say about our own world?